So one of the most frequent requests I get is people looking for information on how to find the most original version of any given kata. So in this video, I want to talk about how and if we can find those original versions, and if we can, what value is there in doing so? So I think the first thing we need to look at is, why do people seek these original versions? And I think there's some legitimate reasons, one of which would be historical curiosity. They just want to know what it's like because they're curious to see what the oldest version of the kata is like, and that strikes me as legit. But I don't think that's what's going on in the vast majority of cases. In the majority of cases that I came across, people are under the assumption that the oldest version must be the best one. It must be the most perfect one, the most pure one. And then you've got to ask, what are you basing that on? Because there's obviously the logical fallacy of appeal to tradition. The older something is, the better it is. And then conversely, we have the logical fallacy of appeal to novelty. The newer it is, the better it is, okay? And we know that better is better. It's not dependent on how old it is. Things can improve over time, as well as get worse over time. So where does this assumption come from? That we need to start with the oldest version. It must be the best one. And I think it's a hangover from 3K thinking. So by that I mean, we've got 3K karate, kata, kumite and kion, and never the three shall meet. All three elements are practiced as independent disciplines. You've got an arbitrary type of kumite, typically point sport style kumite that people do, and that has no bearing on the kata, and it has no bearing on the kion, and people do kion to get good at kion and kata to get good at kata. As a pragmatist, I would judge a kata on its combative utility. So that's independent of how old or new it is. It's entirely possible to have a new version of the kata which is more combatively useful, right? But I think if you're judging the kata arbitrarily, a version is right because somebody said it is right, which is what happens in 3K thinking, then the original version of the kata provides the ultimate, right? That's the one that's been changed the least. Right? So, you may get one instructor who teaches the kata with the hand here, and then the next generation teaches it here. Now, combatively, that makes no difference. But in 3K circles, no, that was wrong, or, this is right, and you get debates over this stuff. So they sometimes seek to settle the debate by going back to the original source, the ultimate one. And that, to me, strikes me as illegitimate, right? And then we've even got to ask the question, do these original versions exist? And that's what I'd like to move on to discuss now. So we have to ask ourselves, did the original version of the kata, as most people think of it, the pure, uncorrupted version, did that ever exist? No, it didn't. And we know it didn't because no one ever settles on their first draft. Things change over time. The creator of the kata didn't have a moment of inspiration, create this kata, and then never modify it. It doesn't work that way. And we know it doesn't work that way. We've got historical records to show it didn't work that way, aside from common sense telling you it wouldn't. So, for example, if you said, I want to learn the original version of the Pinan katas, which original version? Do you want Itosu's first draft, or do you want the version that he settled on? He didn't have an original. He modified them throughout his lifetime. And we know this. There's an interview with Motobu, where Motobu and Itosu are watching some of Itosu's young students doing the Pinan series. And Motobu remarks, oh, they've changed quite a lot. That's quite different from the kata that I originally learned. To which Itosu replied, yes, these are the versions I have settled upon. So which original version do you want? And again, even then, there's an assumption that when Itosu had his final version, he passed them on, telling everyone, now don't change them, and that any change must be negative. One of Itosu's students was Funakoshi, and Funakoshi tells us, this is the quote, there are not now, nor have there ever been, any hard or fast rules regarding the performance of kata. It was much more fluid before the 3K era, where everything got kind of tightened up and must be precise because we've got nothing else to measure it against. We're not measuring by combative utility anymore. We have to measure by these arbitrary aesthetics and arbitrary positions. But before that time, the kata would change and evolve. The different students would do it slightly different ways. So I think it's a fool's errand to go looking for the original because it was never there. The other problem is you can't find it even if you went looking for it, even if it did exist. This is what I call the land that time forgot fallacy, right? So we know, if we're talking in general, unprecise terms, a lot of the kata started life in China, moved to Okinawa, and then found their way to Japan. And we see this a lot where people go, oh, so the Okinawan version is older and therefore purer and therefore better. Logical fallacy on top of logical fallacy. And then, oh, but the Chinese version is even older and therefore even purer and therefore even better. It just compounds a problem. The trouble is that people, I mean, it's obvious when you think about it, but the kata that have been practiced in China today, the forms in China, are the forms being practiced in modern China, not the China of 100 or 200 years ago. You know, so it's wrong to say that the version in China must be older than the version in Okinawa and then on to Japan. It's not true. You know, it could be that the version that's in Japan could have stayed the same for the last 50 years, where those two versions have evolved radically during that time. So you can't just look at the geographic location and go, therefore that is older. We don't have the older versions. They are gone for good. Well, all of the versions, whichever one you're looking at, the Chinese version, the Okinawan version, the Japanese version, it doesn't matter what style, you're looking at them in the modern age. So therefore, you are always looking at a modern version of the kata. Right, so what I now want to move on is to talk about those changes and the impact those have had on the kata that we do have today. So as we've already discussed, just because a kata has changed doesn't mean it has got worse. Whether a change is positive or negative depends on what that change was. It's possible to change the kata and improve it. So I want to talk about some of the changes that we see and then discuss how that may impact on the way we view the katas. The first thing here is I'm talking about the katas that we find within the traditional schools and styles. I'm not talking about the katas that have been radically modified in recent times. The ones that have had multiple high-level kicks added in, that have had the stances exaggerated to the point where horse stance sees the backside being lower than the knees, right? Where there's a screaming kiais on every third move. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about recognizable traditional versions of the kata. So again, we do see changes within them. So some changes that can happen is simply because different lineages prefer a different example of a given concept or idea. So we know that when the kata shows a movement, it's showing you here's a example of it. But you won't always do it exactly the same way because things happen. The guy may be pushing, he may be pulling, he may be taller than you, shorter than you, he may be leaning. You know, the kata gives you a template to work from, but obviously you're going to adapt that in line with what's happening. As Funakoshi said, always perform the kata exactly, combat is another matter. We do the kata in the precise way, so we learn muscle control. When we do the bunkai and the drills, we adapt and vary it. That's what we're supposed to do. You know, like Nakasone said, he goes, never get shackled by the rituals of kata. We should adapt the movement freely according to the opponent's strengths and weaknesses. So you could have a situation, let's say I do a move in the kata and I'm not that tall, but let's pretend I am for the sake of this example. Let's pretend you've got a tall guy, and whenever he does the example, he finds that his enemy's head slightly low and he hits with his forearm like this. So he drops his forearm into his neck. So when he does the kata, he'll have his arm low, because that's how he does it most of the time. And then he teaches it to a student who is shorter. And he finds every time he does the movement, his hand is higher. So he does the kata with the hand higher, right? Before the formalization of kata started, right? And then you've got two versions. And people are like, well, which one's right or wrong? They both are. It makes no difference whatsoever. They're both just differing examples of the same concept. Right? So those changes don't matter. There can be changes made for athletic and aesthetic purposes, like little skips become big jumps. And stances get lengthened slightly, to give it a greater strengthening effect on the legs. Again, I'm not talking about the extreme version I've talked about before. I'm talking about subtle differences. Again, I don't really think they matter so long as you're aware that they're there. So yeah, in the kata we do a jump, but in application we do it as a skip. And we do it as a jump in the kata because it strengthens legs. If you want to do that, then that's fine, right? I don't really have a big problem with those changes either. The other changes that we sometimes have is changing for ease of instruction. We know this happened a lot. Funakoshi talks about this. So little nuances of the movement maybe get lost because they make the movement a bit simpler to make it easier for mass transmission. That could be problematic if that detail was significant, but I often find that's not the case because these little differences are going to get dwarfed by the differences that are going to happen in combat anyway, right? You know, whether the guy's pulling, pushing, tall or shorter, you know, whether you're on a slope, you know, what the obstacles are around you. You're always varying the movement. The kata is just an example to get you started, right? Once you understand that example, you internalize those principles and get used to applying it in lots of different ways. This is the 4-stage approach to kata I've talked about in other videos. So we do have these subtle changes that happen, and I think that's, to me, is the key point. If you're doing a traditional version of the kata, right, where you can compare it to the other version and you can see the little differences, but there's nothing radical. There's not a backflip added in the middle of it or anything like that. Those little changes rarely make no difference. And I liken this to, it's the same message, but in a different font. Right, so you could see something written out in Times New Roman, then in Comic Sans, and then in Arial, and it looks a little different. But if you understand the message, if you can read it, you go, no, it's essentially the same thing, right? So, and I find that's the case that's happening with the traditional versions of the kata. So for me, don't worry about trying to find this fictitious original version, which you can never find anyway, right? The versions that we've had today, the changes that have happened to them are relatively subtle. It's a shift in font. So long as you can understand the combative principles and rules and how to read the kata properly, you'll see that and you'll realize that. You'll realize, to paraphrase Mabuni, that one karate and then many expressions of it. Now, one final footnote on this is there are some versions of the kata that do claim to be old, but again, they're not really. You tend to find is people, oh yeah, no, this is a really old one. It's not. It's a recreated version of something they think might be an older version. So it's still a modern version, right? And as pragmatists, what ultimately matters for us, just as it did for the old masters of the past, it's not seeking an historically pure version. Is this version working for us combatively? Right, so there's no reason to keep the kata exactly the same way it was taught to you. You can change it. You're allowed to do that, right? So long as you feel that the changes that you're making, you have good reason for making them. You feel it's enhancing the kata. You're not just changing arbitrarily or because. So for me, whatever version of the kata you do, stick with it. It will be fine. I've had students come to me from other styles, experienced students of other styles, and when it came to learn the kata, I've said, just keep doing your kata as they do them. Right, so I've got people who have black belts with me who don't do the kata the same way I do. Right, they learned Shotokan kata, do the kata the Shotokan way, or the Kyokushin way, or Shitoryu way. It doesn't make any difference to me whether they do the kata exactly the same as me or not, because that's just the font. What matters to me is that they understand the message. So just a few final thoughts. If you are doing a traditional version of the kata within a pragmatic framework, it's fine. If it's fulfilling the role of traditional kata, it's acting as a repository of knowledge, it's providing a supplementary form of solo practice, it's a vehicle for visualization, it's giving you a chance to work body awareness. If the kata is doing those things, then it is fulfilling the traditional purpose, irrespective of whether it's exactly the same as the version they did a few hundred years ago. If you still have that historical itch, and you say, yeah, but I want to know, you know, what these older versions, you know, way back, you know, the source, what did they look like? One way you could maybe do that is compare the versions that exist today, because you know they all evolved from that common source, right? So if you want to know what the Pinans may have been like a long time ago, look at all the modern versions of the Pinans. Look at the Matsubayashiru version, the Shotokan version, the Shitoryu version, the Wado version. And if you can see the things that are common, those things were undoubtedly part of the older version as well. If you see something that's radically different, a bit of an outlier, that may indicate it was added more recently because it's not in the other versions. That doesn't mean that change is bad, it just means it's different. So for example, if you look at Pinan Godan, Heian Godan in Shotokan, look at the opening movement in any style. You know, in every single style, it moves towards the left. You've got your weight on your back foot, you've got a hand on your hip, your arms bent at 90 degrees at varying heights. So the fundamental things are there. What changes is the font. So we know that the older versions had those same things there because all the modern versions do. So hopefully that's useful. But the key thing is, it doesn't matter. As a pragmatist, it doesn't matter. What you need is a version of the kata that fulfills all the traditional goals. And the weird thing is, that irony is, Back in the past, the old masters weren't thinking about trying to preserve a tradition. They were seeking combative function. So if we seek combative function without being overly concerned about the historical nuances, bizarrely, perhaps even paradoxically, we're being more historically authentic and we're being more traditional because we're pursuing the same things that they pursued, irrespective of whether those little subtleties remain there or not. They didn't care about them. So if you want to do it in a traditional way, you don't care about them. It's the big picture that we need to keep an eye on and how that fits within the wider training matrix. So I hope you found this video interesting. Thank you so much for watching it, and I'll be back with more soon. Okay, take care everyone.